Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So I want to share some observations today that I had about the show Alone. I think it's off to a great start. I watched the Making the Cut episode, which preceded episode 1. The show Alone is really about how people deal with solitude and uncertainty, far more than it is a show about wilderness survival skills. There's one major problem with the show Alone and its attempt to test the individual's capacity to survive in the wilderness. Actually, there's a couple. One is the amount of regulations that the participants have to abide by, be they wildlife or otherwise, which is understandable. But that does, of course, put a limitation on what they can do in order to survive in the show. But the other is the button itself. And I think it's been understated just how relevant a factor the ability to tap out in itself actually is. Now, I know that this show could not exist any other way in our modern society. Anything less than the way it is now would be perceived as unethical, and it would never be able to be made and broadcast. However, I think that the ability to tap out at any point is kind of like the ability to quit a video game at any point and then pick it back up when you want to. Unfortunately, it robs you of your true potential to know what you might have been able to do in that situation. So I feel for a lot of the people who have tapped out, because honestly, I think that without that possibility existing that they could tap out, their performance levels probably would have been much better, because it would have actually been a real survival scenario. And that's the problem with the show Alone, is that it is not a real survival situation. It tries to simulate that, like all of these shows do, to the best of its ability, and it does it for the most part in a very thoroughly engaging way that I enjoy. I give the show a 10 out of 10. I love the way every episode is so dense in its content, the way they go back and forth between all the characters and their minor struggles that they're having. I think it's a great show which can teach us a lot. However, you need to understand that in a true survival situation, there's going to be something that wakens within you that cannot be awoken under conditions like this. Now, I know that human beings, and they've done social psychological experiments to show that in simulations like this, people do tend to perceive it as being reality to some extent. But so long as you have the ability to tap out, you're not going to be as motivated to survive. I'm going to provide you with a really simple example here. So when I'm in the gym, oftentimes people will offer me a spot because they'll see me struggling with heavy weight. When I am in the gym, I find that if somebody's spotting me, I don't put enough energy into what I'm doing. It's as if there's a safety net there, I don't perform to the best of my ability, and I get a little lazy. I don't have that drive, that will, that if I don't push this weight up, it could fall down on me and kill me. And there's an immense amount of adrenaline that gets released when you know that you're in a situation like that, and that can't really be simulated in this experiment when you can pretty much just run back to the boat. Every one of them has my admiration and respect for putting themselves in this kind of situation where there are very real risks. So when I say this, I don't mean it in a way that is disparaging towards them. In fact, I'm complimenting a lot of the people who push that button quite early, because I think that if they hadn't pushed that button, I think a lot of those people would have been able to go much, much further than they thought they could. What I've personally discovered in my life is that after any extensive tribulation, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. If you can make it through that one rainy night where you just want to give up, but you just don't, and then the sun comes out in the morning, your stuff starts to dry off, all of a sudden you start to see the possibilities, and it's not that bad. One of the characters, I think his name was Larry, in episode 1, he was really struggling from the get-go as he was trying to make his way up that steep incline there to try to find a shelter, and he was swearing and cursing, and it's something I think a lot of people would end up doing. And props to him for actually filming that and showing his emotion being expressed in a true way and not trying to mask it. But after he made it through that whole debacle and finally built a shelter, there was a moment of peace where he said, man, this place is beautiful. If you can endure through the hardest times, not even in survival, but just in your life period, there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel if you can just push on far enough. It's just not giving up before the miracle happens. I know it sounds cliche, but a lot of people, and I found this in terms of mountain climbing, that the closer and closer you get to the peak of that mountain, the harder and harder it gets, the steeper and steeper it gets, the thinner and thinner the air gets. Every step you take, you really lose half a step because there's no more soil and vegetation to hold all those loose stones together, and it seems like it takes forever when you first see the peak to actually getting there. But when you finally get there and the clouds break for a minute and the sun hits you, you realize that it was all worth it. So something I would like people to consider is that a lot of these people who are pushing the button and tapping out early likely would have made it much further in a real life situation. I think that the writers and directors, producers of the show were able to get lucky with this idea of playing on this desire we all have. And when I say we who are bound to the machine, we who are dependent on technology for our survival at all costs, taking us into this fantasy realm of isolationism that we all desire to test ourselves in, and sort of seeing how it plays out. But I think one thing that needs to be noted with this show, when we're talking about testing survival skills, and this is one observation I've had about the survivalist community, which you can call it wrong if you want, but I would just call it overly preoccupied with the idea of lone wolf survival. And this show really propagates that. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I love the show. I think it's great. It does address the deep psychological response when a person is taken from the group. But as I was saying, one thing that the show really omits is that as human beings, we were meant to survive in groups. We were meant to survive as a tribe. And typically speaking, the person who was banished from the community, who was exiled for whatever reason, or who perhaps voluntarily exiled themselves, it didn't last that long. Obviously, they're not able to procreate, so their genes wouldn't last that long. So it's counterproductive from an evolutionary standpoint to isolate yourself from other people. So the unique survival challenge that's presented in this film is not something which is natural to human beings. We are not meant to be solitary creatures. If we were, we wouldn't have words, because words without other people to communicate to are just elaborate forms of personal amusement. So in testing one's ability to survive alone, it's testing far more than just survival skills. I really do think what's tested in this show is not your ability to start fires and sit under a shelter and catch food. Those are all relevant factors for sure. Being in the wilderness and surviving and being alone there are two distinct things. And one of the participants said in passing a little cliche about how, it's not about the threats outside, it's about the threats inside. And I do think that there's not enough attention towards that in the survivalist and prepper community, just how challenging isolationism would be. But if you're not comfortable being by yourself, if you're somebody who needs to be a part of a group, then this show is going to teach you how to be alone. There could not be a better title for this show, because if you're talking about a long-term grid down situation where you're one of the sole survivors, which of course is going to be a very rare thing. Perhaps none of you listening would be so lucky to even be able to test this theory, that what's going to break you first is not going to be the lack of sustainable resources that are available to you. Rather, what's going to make all the difference is how well you can be alone. And I love the part of that show where seconds after the people have been dropped off, they realize what they've done. And if you watched a lot of survival TV shows and people who independently film themselves doing this in the past, most people think that this phenomenon or fad started with the show Alone. Well, there's many YouTubers who have done similar rites of passage like this in the past on their own YouTube channels, where they would go out and see how long they could survive. But that moment in which the plane is flying away, where the truth sinks in, and it's almost a physiological reaction that these people have, because I've somewhat experienced it in a pseudo sense, being choppered into cut blocks that I used to work on when I worked in forestry and tree planting, where we would be choppered in, and when that helicopter left, you realize that, okay, now if some big giant grizzly bear or something was to come out of the bushes, I would be left to my own devices to deal with that situation. There's a certain level of vulnerability to that, but at the same time, there's a lot of freedom. There was another quote reference in the show about this, how, solitude and freedom go hand in hand, in that technological dependence in many ways robs you of your freedom. And this really is a cry for that freedom that most of these people wanted. However, I don't think the isolationist factor sinks in for a lot of people until they're really alone. So I think when people watch this, what I would encourage you to do is not look at the survival skills so much in terms of how they survived. I mean, if you want to learn that, go to Vancouver Island, live in Victoria or Nanaimo for a bit and form a base camp there, network with some of the local native populations, and they'll teach you how to survive out there, at least the ones who are still practicing that traditional way. But what you should be aware of here is how these people cope with being alone and having nothing but a button as your communication to the outside world. If you haven't experienced it yet, if you don't know what it's like to be left alone and responsible for your own life, to know that all of the emergency services, all the technology, all the safety nets that have been in place your whole life have all of a sudden been lifted instantaneously, and you know that there's going to be probably a fairly long time delay from when you push that button to when help comes. The main challenges then are going to be psychological in nature. Survival when you're alone is challenging no matter where you are. You could be living in one of the biggest mansions in the world. If you're alone for 46 days straight and you have no communication with the outside world, you're probably going to fold in some way. You're going to have a psychotic break of sorts, possibly be worse than if you were in the woods, because that is our natural environment. The concrete jungle is a superimposition that has only been in place for the last couple hundred years. It's not something that our genetics is geared towards yet, but we are geared towards being alone in the wilderness. And even that, as I've said, we're not geared towards being alone. We're geared towards being in a tribe in the wilderness. The show is not testing people's ability to survive in the wilderness at all. I'm going to go that far, and I'm going to say it's not about that at all, because all of these people have the skill sets to survive. If you looked at, I'd say 75% of the participants who folded in last season, it was due not to the fact that they had to give up, but that they chose to give up. In their minds, they may have felt they had to give up because the threat seemed to be real. The amount of technology you have at your disposal is not the deciding factor, ever. The deciding factor is going to be how well you manage the thoughts in your own head, and you certainly will be having many of them, because you will have no other use for words than to either torment or uplift yourself with debilitating or motivating internal dialogue. By and large, what defeats people out there is their minds. because in so many occasions, people could double back, change their game plan, re-strategize, find another plan that's going to work, and implement that plan. Instead, a lot of people tend to drift off into negative thinking, into fear, into sadness, or some other all-encompassing emotion which paralyzes them. When the reality is, the best approach to take is the rational one, is focusing on what can I do now? Each one of those participants, you might not have noticed it, but in every one of the environments, there was different advantages. So for instance, the guy who was on the steep slope, there was an absence of predators because of the fact that, not a lot of predators are going to want to go down that steep incline to get to the water or whatever they have to do. They're just not interested in that. They take the path of least resistance. And with Desmond, for instance, he seemingly had some flat ground there. He was sawing driftwood, so he had dry wood to make a fire. Even though he was somewhat paralyzed by fear, he was in the process of making fire that could have protected him against the animals, because the animals don't like fire. And the girl who had her tent flooded out, there was a moment there where she was seriously thinking about quitting. She doesn't vocalize that, but you can tell that that's what the thought is. But instead, she made the choice. And this is what it all comes down to. It's a choice to whether or not you want to regroup and try again. If at first you don't succeed, try again. What I know from some of the stressful situations I've been in my life is that the tide can turn very quickly on things. At 1 second, you can be down and out. You can be in the total shithouse. But if you just endure beyond that critical point, it's as if you transcend a new comfort zone. So I would just say, if you do find yourself in a survival situation, to don't give up before the miracle happens. You have to discern between what is a mental barrier and what is an actual physiological barrier. Because a lot of these people weren't dying, they weren't hypothermic. And it almost seems like that which people think is going to be a problem out there does inevitably become the problem, because that's what they focus on. So if you go in there thinking that the main threat is going to be bears and wildlife, which it is definitely a threat, but if that's what you are focused on, then that's probably what's going to take your attention away, and you're going to hyper fixate on it so much that you may even inadvertently attract it to you. In the same way, if you feel that finding food is going to be the biggest problem, you may find yourself scrambling to find food, and in the process of being obsessed with that one thing, not see the possibilities that might present themselves in other ways. Or you may be fixated on getting food in one way and not open to the possibilities of seeing things in other ways. The show alone, it's not about wilderness skills. It's about how well you can be with yourself and how well you can manage the ongoing subvocal dialogue that's going on in your head when you're out there. You need to remember that communication and words and language really are the enemy of the individual man. You really are the only person to converse with at that point. And because of that, the dialogue that you have with yourself is going to dictate your outcomes. The show alone is really about how people deal with solitude and uncertainty, far more than it is a show about wilderness survival skills. In an age when we are so technologically dependent for our survival, when everything around us is this cocoon which nourishes our every need, everything in our environment has been fabricated by somebody. And when one of those things is out of place or non-functional, our lives are affected by that. So you take that person who is a tribal-based person. We're all tribal-based people. People are not meant to be alone. And the whole premise of this show is unnatural in that respect, because human beings are not meant to be solitary creatures. There are some people who are introverted, who spend the majority of their time by themselves, but by and large, we are people who require communication, not only for our psychological well-being, but obviously to meet our physical needs, because it's impossible for the lone wolf to survive in the wilderness for an extensive period of time. I shouldn't say impossible, but very improbable for somebody to achieve a very comfortable way of life in the wilderness. And you got to think, if you're a lone wolf and you don't procreate, well, there's a genetic dead end right there. So that trait of lone wolfness gets breeded out rather quickly, to such an extent that I doubt that it's very prevalent, if at all present, in the population today. You have to also recognize that you're not really alone, that you're surrounded by life, that you're surrounded by everything but human beings. And so you have the capacity, you have the potential. The only barriers between long-term survival in that scenario, really, for those people with those skill sets, is a psychological one. I think the show alone has a lot to teach people about how it would be to survive in solitude in a long-term post-collapse environment, and how you would endure that. Because I propose that no matter what the environment, whether all your physical needs were met or not, I would hypothesize, we'll say, that most people are going to wane in their sanity at some point, regardless of whether you're in the jungle or you're in a mansion and you have all your needs met. You could be in a bunker and have everything you possibly needed. If you were by yourself, I think after 6 weeks in the wilderness, you might fare a lot better than you would than if you were in a bunker. That's just a theory of mine. I think that the isolation factor is the most challenging one for people to overcome, and it's not really a question of needs being met. It's a question of being able to not let your emotions get the best of you and force you into some sort of psychosis. And the ability to go with the flow of nature and not feel like you're something outside of it, which is entering into it like some sort of parasite, will aid you in the process of finding a balance when you're out there trying to survive. Most of these people who leave, I don't think any of them actually had an imminent threat and left the island before they pushed the button. I think it was 99% psychological reasons as to why they left. So that's a lesson I get from the show alone. Thoroughly express my thoughts for you here today. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. Canadian Prepper out.
Check out the Canadian Preppers Network blog, an excellent resource for survivalists and preppers.